So I am now hoping you can actually see a screen that's got the title screen on, and it looks something like that. So just thumbs up, fantastic. So we'll leap straight in, and if people join us, they'll join us, and that would be brilliant. So this evening's talk has this parapsychology and psychical research theme, and I'll explain a bit about why I'm interested in that as we go on. In fact, I probably can say that my interest in esoteric knowledge and magic and shamanism and stuff goes back as far as my interest in parapsychology, and the two run parallel for a while. So we'll talk about that. So let's define what we're going to talk about first. Define our terms. Parapsychology is really the attempt at scientifically studying such things as clairvoyancy, telekinesis, telepathy, mental abilities. And the reason it's parapsychology and not psychology is that all these particular skills, talents, abilities exist outside of the frame of normal science. The word para means alongside. So that's parapsychology, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then we're going to talk about psychical research. The two are very similar. They're overlapped in similar ways, but the older term for it is psychical research, and it was started in the sort of 1800s, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But again, its focus is slightly different. Its focus is the idea of mental activity existing apart from the body. So the very early psychical research was all involved with spiritism and spiritualism. Spiritism and spiritualism are two different things. And at this point, something that Haley said yesterday on one of the groups was that I recommended a film called Kardec, which is a film on Netflix. And Kardec is actually about the scientist who got very interested in spiritualism and spiritism and broke away from science in the 1800s. And it's a very interesting story. So they're the two differences. If we need to define our terms, we've got to get to grips with this word psychic. If I use the word psychic anywhere, there is a very good chance that people assume I'm talking about clairvoyancy, telepathy, in fact, these paranormal abilities. In fact, we need to remember the word psychic actually derives from the word for mind and the word for soul. And it's got connections to the goddess Psyche, who was the deification of the human soul. And that's caused a confusion, because in some texts, books that are actually non-paranormal, you will read the word psychic energy. Carl Jung particularly used the word psychic energy, and he wasn't actually talking about paranormal. What he was talking about was the energy of the mind. And what has happened since the dawn of spiritualism, 1800s or so, that word was subsumed to assume that it was clairvoyancy, telepathy, and all those other things, which is why people call themselves psychics. And I think it's really interesting. When I do some stage shows, and one of the things I talk about at the start of my stage show is the fact that I consider myself to be a mentalist. Now, there are three definitions of that kind of word. One definition is the fact that you're mental, nuts. The other definition is that you are actually involved in some kind of weird connection of the mind and behavior and that kind of stuff. But the third is the philosophical definition, whereby mentalism is about a belief in the connectedness of mind and nature, mind and the universe. And mentalism, as a philosophical approach, predates many of the things that we're going to talk about. It goes right the way back to something called the Golden Tablets of Hermes, and then the Kabbalion, which was talking about the 7 universal laws, which then got borrowed by books like The Secret and then popularized and taken out of context. So remember, when the word psychic is being used, it's got lots of different definitions, which actually creates a problem in doing any form of research. Because if we can't define our terms, how do we know what we're measuring or looking for or researching? So I already mentioned that paranormal is a word that's made up of two words, para and normal, and para is alongside and normal is normal. So if psychic ability, if clairvoyancy, telepathy, metal bending, telekinesis were part of the everyday world, it wouldn't be paranormal, it would be normal. A great comedian once said that what's the difference between alternative medicine and medicine? And he came up with the answer that alternative medicine, when it works, it's called medicine. So we shift our mental definition of what is working. And some stuff, for reasons we'll explore, sits outside of the world of science and rationality. I'm not sure for how much longer that's going to happen, but it does at the moment. So two organizations in the UK that are really worth knowing about, the Society for Psychical Research, they are still taking members, you can still join. They were set up in 1882 by a group of scientists, William Crookes was one of them, who were interested in the emergence of spiritualism. They were really interested in the messages that mediums were picking up. Now, we have to bear in mind that the spiritualism we're talking about with mediums may go back to shamanic tradition of a walking between worlds, but in the way that it was talked about in the 1800s, it was about talking to the departed. And it became a big thing. In fact, we know that the ladies that really gave birth to spiritualism, we can almost track down the date specifically and the day to when spiritualism was born. It was created by the Fox sisters, who were three sisters who claimed to be having conversations with the beyond with various cliques and raps and stuff. And they attracted a big attention. And so spiritualism was born out of these ladies doing sittings for people who would come to their little New York house, or it was really a hut in the woods, and they would do these seances, for want of a better word. Of course, science goes back a long time, but when we talk about spiritualism in the form we know it, it can be dated back to the Fox sisters. Later on in time, the Fox sisters agreed, they revealed that they were actually faking the noises. But that didn't stop the fact that people said, well, they're faking, but all these other mediums aren't. And what we now know as spiritualism actually developed in the 1800s. And there's a real interesting idea there that in the 1800s, so many other religions came into being, or spiritual pathways. Mormonism came into being, Jehovah's Witnesses came into being, and I kind of have a theory, which we won't go into now, but that was a response to the mechanization of the world and people thinking that they were more than just machines from the Industrial Revolution and stuff. So that's the Society for Psychical Research, which I was a member for and I did some investigations for, which we'll talk more about later. The one that I'm interested in more now is this thing called the Association for the Scientific Study of Anomalous Phenomena. It was a breakout group in the 1980s from SPR, and they take a slightly different approach, as we'll see, about what to research, what to investigate, and what field studies are. You see, SPR was set up by scientists who were trying to give scientific validation to the psychic abilities, to mediumship, whereas ASAP, by the way, if I get that right, they were more interested in exploring the phenomena and the experience of the phenomena and recording it and then looking for commonalities. It was kind of like a different approach. And most skeptics who would have turned away from parapsychological research actually embraced the methodology of ASAP. Again, you can join them. They do free investigator training weekends for members, and you get a nice glossy magazine with all kinds of weird stuff if it floats your boat. Michael Bentine, the comedian, the goon, was a founding member of ASAP. As you know, Michael may or may not know, Michael Bentine was very much into the paranormal. He was very much into spiritualism. And then a guy called Lionel Fanthorpe, or Reverend Lionel Fanthorpe, who you may remember from Fortune TV and all that kind of stuff. He was the last president. I think he's moved on now. I've been lucky enough to talk with Lionel. He's a great guy, very interesting guy. He's an Anglican vicar with a really open mind about what this stuff is all about, and he's very smart. So I've got an interview with Lionel that I will eventually put up onto the membership site. I've got an interview with some of these other people that I'm trying to track down, edit, and put onto the membership site, so it'll be there for you to look at. So there are two approaches to look at parapsychology and psychic research or psychical research. One is to explain the cause of the effect, which is an older view, but the other one is to explore the experience of the effect, whatever it is, and then share those and look at the conditions the experience happened in, and then look at for interpretations by the people and by others. And ASAP is really focused on the fact that these are anomalous phenomena, hence the title of their membership, anomalous phenomena. You can't guarantee they're always going to show up. When they do show up, they're worth recording. And their approach is actually collating these bits of information and then eventually writing reports and sharing the stuff to see what the commonalities are. It's a very interesting approach. It's very humanistic. And the way I can understand it from the way I used to work, when I was a member of the SPR, if somebody said to me they'd had a weird experience, they'd seen a ghost or whatever it was, and they'd usually say something like, "So explain that then," I thought that was an invitation for me to give them other alternatives that were non-paranormal, which they got mightily pigged off about, because what they really wanted me to do was validate their experience. So once I'd actually got over that kind of, well, I'm interested in science, I want to get to the root of it, I suddenly realized that a better question when somebody tells you something about their experience is, and what does that mean to you? And where do you take that? And how does that fit within what you believe about the world? A much more interesting set of questions, I believe. So that sets the background up, really. And I just need to talk about science and pseudoscience. Where the ASAP logo is, that's taken directly from their website or edited from the website. Science works in a particular way, and I think some people don't get the way science works, which cause all kinds of problems when the press get hold of scientific discoveries and they write articles that say scientists now believe that the God particle exists within the pineal gland or whatever. And what happens when the media reports science is they misunderstand the scientific process. Scientific processes proceed from an observation and then create some kind of working hypothesis, which is tested to falsify. And it's a big difference. Scientists don't get and prove anything. Scientists actually go out and test what they think they know to see where the gaps are in what they know and to see whether they can break the hypothesis. So if the hypothesis was every time a red car goes past, a cat jumps out the window, they would actually look for all the times that a red car goes past and the cat doesn't jump out the window, because they're trying to disprove their stated position. And it's a very interesting way of doing it, because they don't get caught up on the whole, and we're talking now about good science, by the way, don't get caught up on the whole of proving things. Now, once a hypothesis has been proven to be falsifiable, it's not longer considered. But if it resists being falsified, it becomes an idea to be tested. And if it passes various criteria, it becomes a theory. So scientific theory in science language isn't just an approximation of what happens. Scientific theory is something that can be tested and it withstands the tests. And more importantly, scientific theory makes predictions which can extend its remit. So gravity is a theory, the theory of gravity. We've got an idea of how it works, but we can predict planetary orbits and things based upon those theories. Quantum mechanics or quantum physics is a theory because it predicts the behavior of the very small, and it's passed all its little tests. And as we'll talk about later, quantum mechanics has gone from pure mathematics into demonstrable physical things within the world. Pseudoscience, however, doesn't work like that. Pseudoscience actually goes out with no clear remit, with no clear idea of what they're testing, and they take any variable and they ignore the thing to look at because they know what they're looking for. And then the first thing they will do is, rather than publishing it to a peer group for review of their methods, they often publish it to the press, and the press get all the, and it's kind of a weird situation. These things are coming together more now. There are more people interested in the paranormal who are taking a more, shall we say, science-based approach to it, and therefore they're more, for me, they're more interesting. Okay. There is a kind of link we need to get around when somebody goes out to do some work in whatever area of parapsychology or the paranormal or psychic stuff. There's very often a lack of clarity of what they're looking at. And I'll explain that in more detail at the moment, in a moment. But if you don't know what specifically you're looking at and how you're basing the measurements of your observations, how do you know that what you're looking at has been found? In fact, often the protocols in pseudoscience are so vague that almost any interpretation can apply. And that doesn't mean the interpretation is wrong. It doesn't mean that the experiences are invalid. But what it does mean is it will get ignored by people who are calling themselves scientists, for reasons we'll go into in a moment. One of the biggest word problems that exists between science and the paranormal or mysticism or whatever you want to call it is this use of the word energy. Science has a very, and I've written about this lots of times, science has a very clear definition of what energy is. Energy is a verb, really. Energy is the ability to do work. That's it, which is why Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared, is so important to this, because the energy that results from the mass and the speed of light actually comes out as a measurement, usually about movement or usually about some other kind of change. And as far as science is concerned, there are only a handful of sources of energy that they can measure. And really, this is the kind of diagram that sums it all up, really. Now, some paranormal research works on the fact that there are things within the electromagnetic spectrum that have an effect, and maybe they do. There are things within the sort of electrical chemical domain that have an effect, and maybe they do. But often paranormal research falls into the trap of using the word energy as a noun. Energy fields, which may or may not exist, but it's not the scientific use of energy. Energy transference in the sense of body to body, the human energy field, we can measure some of these things. But if we go too far down that non-specific route, scientists will actually look at it and say, well, tell me what the energy is. Tell me what you're measuring. And some paranormal researchers will go, well, it's an energy that you haven't discovered yet. Well, that's not a very sensible answer, because if you can't define the energy within the framework, you have to find evidence for the existence of the other energy that you're claiming. And you can see now we're in a minefield, right? We're in a minefield of philosophy and approaches and beliefs and attitudes that I think there's a reconciliation for, but I'm not so sure that science asks the right questions. So here's an example, there's this idea that ghosts produce cold spots. How? What's going on there, right? And in fact, every house has a cold spot. Every house has more than one cold spot. But do we give it more significance if we're exploring a haunted house than if exploring Aunt Mabel's country home or something? Not that I've got an Aunt Mabel or a country home. And so it makes assumptions about the link between temperature and ghosts, which has not been proven. However, it doesn't stop people selling ghost hunters expensive equipment like infrared thermometers to measure cold spots in a house. In fact, some people I've spoken to have got one of these in their ghost hunting kit, an infrared thermometer, and I've said to them, what does it measure? And I said that it measures clouds or disembodied vapors that may pass. No, it doesn't, because the red infrared light goes straight through to the wall and it measures the temperature of the wall. And this basic misunderstanding of what they're measuring creates problems when it comes to be reported, because the skeptics or the cynics, more damagingly, will point at all these flaws in logic. So we have to ask lots of questions about the things we're measuring and the things we're assuming. And that comes down to something really simple. If we're saying that there's such a thing as spirit communication, or there is spirit communication, it has underlying assumptions or beliefs about that. The belief is, first of all, spirits exist. Secondly, that they want to and can talk to us, and somebody can talk to them. Now, that's not a problem, because that may well be happening. But the point is, what do you measure? What do you go out and measure? If you go out and measure the accuracy of a psychic reading, well, psychic readings are often very personal and will resonate with the individual. They may well have verifiable data, but is that necessarily recorded correctly? And so if you're going to do a psychic investigation on mediums, and I'll talk about one that I did a few years ago, you need to be very specific about what you're looking for, and the assumptions behind it. And there's all kinds of these assumptions, because believing is perceiving. If I believe something, the very neurology, my brain wiring, will actually make me selectively find the information that's going to validate my beliefs. An example I used in the NLP training for people was that, if I believe in Father Christmas, where does that belief come from? Well, the belief is a tabletop supported by legs of evidence. And the evidence is what I observe. I observe my parents telling me about Father Christmas, my teachers, my friends telling me. I observe presents on Christmas morning, and I observe, the half-eaten carrot and the drunk bottle of port, and the footsteps in the snow to the fireplace, and reindeer droppings on the lawn outside, which is, my grandfather was really inventive, and that sustains my belief. Does the belief affect my behavior? Certainly does, because months before Christmas, my parents could say, "Remember Father Christmas, naughty nice list," and that may influence my behavior. Does it affect my perception? Damn right it does, because if I actually go to sleep on Christmas Eve, any sound in the house could be instantly understood as being the ringing of the sleigh bells, the arrival of Santa, the coming down the chimney. Now, I'm not saying that didn't happen. Maybe it did. What I am saying is that my belief actually focused my perceptions, and my perceptions are actually the thing that are driving my understanding, which begs another question. It does beg another question, and the question it begs is that if I believe something and I get involved in paranormal research about something I believe, what's that going to do to the data? Can I really step aside from it? Or am I just going to look for things that validate it? Richard Wiseman is professor of psychology at Hartford University. I know Richard, goes back a long way. He wrote a paper, which I'm going to put into the group, into the membership site, called Belief in the Paranormal and Suggestion in the Seance Room. And that came from a discussion that I had with him and a guy called Andy Nyman years and years ago about Victorian seances, because we all happen to be interested in Victorian seances. And I said to Richard, do we know what's really going on in Victorian seances, or what was going on? And so what Richard did was he decided to create an experiment whereby people were taken to a seance, which was set up in the basement of the university. It was a dark room. They got an actor to play the part of the medium. And on the table in front of the seance group were objects that were used in Victorian seances: tambourines, bells, balls, trumpets, whatever. And all these had dots on them, sort of luminous dots on them. And some of them were rigged to move. So during the seance, the ball would roll a little bit because it was on a piece of string pulled by the actor. Of course, people in there couldn't see that because they were in blackout. There was also, in some of the experiments, a person dressed in black clothing leaning against the black curtain, so it couldn't be seen at all. And he occasionally would come around with bits of cotton on a rod or bits of cold water. The methods that actually Victorian spiritualists were accused of using, and people would experience this stuff. Now, prior to the experiment, people were given questionnaires about whether they were believers, non-believers, or open-minded. And when, at the end of the seance, they were debriefed, the believers saw more happening than was actually really happening. And when they were shown an infrared video of the seance, when the ball didn't fly around the room but just rolled a couple of centimeters, they said the video had been doctored. The open-minded people were able to give a fairly accurate report of what actually happened in the seance room. The ball rolled a bit, I felt something on my face, don't know what it was, but I felt it was really interesting. The non-believers failed to see a number of the events. They failed to see the ball roll, and it did. They failed to see the bell ring, and it did. And when they were shown the video, they had the same excuse as the believers. You've doctored that video. That's not what happened. And so the belief system influenced the reaction to the emotional situation they were in. And this is quite a considerable thing to think about, you know. Now, I'll add another experiment that Richard did, and you can find a lot of his stuff online. But the other thing he did, which was really interesting, and I'll talk about another one later on possibly, was he took people to places that was purportedly haunted. And they were to walk around the room, the haunted place, with a map, and they were to indicate on it anytime they felt something different or odd or weird. The idea being there are two groups of people, a set of believers and a set of open-minded or even skeptics, cynics, and they did the experiments one at a time. And what happened was the sensitive people actually marked on the map places that they felt were a bit weird or felt a bit different. And there was a strong link between the places that the non-believers marked on the map as feeling a bit weird. The only difference would be is the believers interpreted it as ghosts or spirits, and the non-believers said, well, it's something weird, I don't know what it is. Which means to me, something was in that space that could be felt, even though it couldn't be interpreted, which really is interesting. So coming back to ghost hunting, which I know quite a few people are into, and I used to do ghost investigations, and I bought this, I was going to say crap then, I bought this material because I thought I needed it to do investigations. I bought the infrared thermometers, and I told you about those, that they just measure cold spots. I bought the EMF meter. I bought the tri-band multi-directional EMF meter, which cost an arm and a leg. But then I kind of realized I don't know what I'm measuring. I'm measuring AC current or small amounts of DC current. So how do ghosts affect the meter? And in fact, giving the meter to somebody that didn't believe in ghosts and getting them to go to their home, they found fluctuations as profound as fluctuations that were in a haunted house. So I'm not sure of the value. And if you look on the sites that sell this stuff, by the way, at the very bottom of near the sites, it says this item is not proven to detect ghosts. But because the uprise in the last 20 years of most haunted television shows, and everybody's got one, then people who do this stuff believe they have to have one. Thermal cameras, same kind of thing. If you're using a thermal camera, then assume that the spirit or the ghost or whatever it is actually has a thermal footprint. No evidence of that. EVP filters. EVP is electric voice phenomena, which again we can talk about in another session. But EVP is where you record the ambient sound, ask questions, and because you've got a white noise filter on it, you will hear sounds that appear to answer your questions, which is really spooky. Except when you find these online, you need to look very carefully, because some of these EVP recordings are hours apart. There's the question, and then there's 3-4 hours before something that sounds like an answer is edited together. So the spirit communication, even by the people that are doing it, doesn't work this way, but it's great stuff for horror movies. And EVP filters, the idea of electronic voice phenomena, featured into a guy who actually set up a business called Spiricom, where he was making these things and claimed that he was being able to be directed by the voices through the radio. You can look all this stuff up. It's fascinating. Now, I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm saying that how do we know the source of that voice, that answer? And how do we know the answer is what we think we hear? You've probably all heard the story about the Beatles hoax, John Lennon and the Beatles, that Paul McCartney is dead. And if you find a musicologist to explore all those facts about how they can prove Paul McCartney is dead, one of the things I'll get you to do is actually play a record backwards, and you hear John Lennon saying, "I buried Paul." But you only hear that because you were told that's what it was going to say. Yeah. And so your mind has already filtered possibilities out because there's an expectation of what you're going to hear. And the reason I'm mentioning this is not because I'm dismissing paranormal and psychic research. I'm simply saying if we're going to go and do it, we need to be very careful and very clear about our methods and why we're using that method to do the research that we want to do. Infrared sensors, I had several of those when I did an investigation at Tregenna Castle. I took a load of infrared sensors and put them across the various places and then sat down waiting for something to happen. And one of these sensors tripped off. It scared the shit out of me. But I don't know what tripped it off. And then I started to think, well, if ghosts or spirits are incorporeal and there's no temperature, what's the infrared sensor measuring? And it turned out to be a window that had opened and a draft had blown through. So the thing we're looking at here is the difference between, shall we say, a scientific method and what I think parapsychologists and para people do. Science approaches it step by step. It has an observation, it sets a hypothesis which can falsify. It's reductionist, it takes out as many variables as possible, and then it's blinded, so the people doing the research don't really know what the answers could or should be. And sometimes it's triple and double and triple blinded. So the people who are doing the experiment have got no idea what's being looked for. Really important. I don't see many, shall we say, psychic investigation groups double blinding their research. I see a lot of them charging people to go and spend the night in Bodmit jail and charging lots of money to stay overnight and do some research. That's theatre. It's not research. And then once it's blinded, it's analysed. And then it's reported, shared, critiqued, and revisited. That's the scientific method. The method that ASAP are trying to get us to use, and one I think is really rewarding, is the idea that we have an experience, it reads an observation, we record the observation, we collect information about that observation without trying to interpret it. We find out what the belief systems of the observer are. We review multiple cases and then we make a conclusion of where the cases are similar or not. And then we report them, we share them, we critique them and revisit them. So the end sections are the same. But there are two different approaches, and pseudoscience doesn't understand the two different approaches and it flip-flops between them. I remember talking to one of the investigators on Most Haunted, the parapsychologist Kieran, I've forgotten his surname now, and I've got an interview with him as well. I'll try and share that on the site when I dig it out. And it's really interesting talking privately about them, that he was actually saying that actually the best tools for any kind of investigation is people that can observe and make notes, possibly a camera, and that's it, or maybe a tape recorder, and that's it. You don't need this stuff because you need to be in the moment, in the place. And he wasn't very complimentary to some of the people on the Most Haunted team. And actually, in fairness, he actually said as much publicly and when he was reporting on the parapsychological influences of the reports. I love this quote here, which is from John Archibald Wheeler. Now, John Wheeler was a theoretical physicist who was really involved in quantum mechanics and stuff, but he really said what Tony mentioned at the start. He said, we live on an island surrounded by a sea of ignorance. As our island knowledge grows, so does the shore of our ignorance. The more we know, the less we know, and the more questions we have. The problem is with pseudoscience particularly, it finds some information, makes it fit, and then they assume that's the end. And that's the stuff that gets into popularized books and actually has a problem. So I'm going to give you some examples of psi research, and we're going to talk about them a little bit. In the UK, as far as I'm aware, there are only 2 universities that got departments of parapsychology. One was Goldsmiths College in London, which used to be managed by Chris French, interesting guy. And the other one is the Kessler Institute, which is in the Department of Psychology in Edinburgh University. I've done some of their courses, and they're really interesting. So if you want to do this more academically, Kessler Institute used to do a kind of online introduction course for, I know, not a lot of money, which introduced to all the concepts, and then they do extension courses, which you can do if you want to. So let's have a look at this. Let's start with something that you all know about probably. In the 1950s, a character called J.B. Rhine was investigating, amongst other things, the idea that people could read minds, clairvoyance, and he started using playing cards as the test subject. So the experiment would look at a card and the person would name what kind of card it was. And the problem with the playing card is there are 3 things that you can be, or 4 things you can be right or wrong on. You can be right on the color, you can be right on the suit, you can be right on high or low, and then picture or pip. And so it wasn't very satisfactory. So he came up with what are called Rhine cards or Zener cards. I've showed you before, they're kind of symbols. That's the square, that's the cross, and that's the wavy lines. Forget about the colors on this, doesn't matter. They're the circles, and then there's a square. So 5 symbols repeated 5 times. And the idea would be somebody would take a card, look at it, they would be the sender, and the receiver would see what image they get instantly. So let's do this right now. I'm going to look at a card, I'm going to send it to you, and then you can tell me what you think it is, and then I'll see if you're right. This is not scientific, by the way, because there's too many of you in the test and you wouldn't all be telling each other what you'd seen. But anyway, first card I'm looking at now. Remember, it can be a circle, a cross, a wavy line, square, or a star. What do you think I'm looking at?
Sorry to butt in there, Alan, but you are wearing glasses.
Yeah, you can see it, can you?
Possibly, if I tried, yes.
Right, that's fantastic for noting that. That was the first problem with the whole protocol. They actually had experimenters wearing glasses, right? And people getting great results. And nobody thought to take the glasses off. So now, okay, I'm looking at one now. Cross, wavy line, circle, star, or a square. Actually, draw the symbol, so then you won't appear on the screen. Draw the symbol. You can draw a square, star. What do you think? Just draw it on your screen so you can see it. Squares. We've got don't know, but don't know. Okay. Just mark yourself whether you're right. It was a circle. All right. Okay. I'll do one more because we could spend all night doing this. Okay. I'm looking at another one. Okay. It's either a circle, cross, wavy line, star, or square. Wavy lines, square. Okay. It's actually a wavy lines. Okay. Now pat yourself on the back if you got either of those right. The thing about this set of cards is, to be statistically significant, you have to get 1 in 5 right, or that's 5 out of 25. Anything over that is kind of significant, and anything under that can also be significant. So I'm not going to put you through this, but J.B. Rhine would do this test for hours. He would do dozens and dozens of runs to analyze the data. And at the end of all those runs, there was very little that actually proved one way or another. Slightly better than chance, some people were better, but it had a methodological flaw. I'll put my glasses back on. The first flaw it has, as Tony noticed, was undue influence from the sender. It could be glasses, but it could be something they said, because I deliberately paused and looked at a card on one of them, which you may have taken, I was just checking that was the one. You may have read that body language. Or you may have noticed that I actually looked away when it was the one it was. So the influence of the experimenter was the problem. There's another big problem. Most magicians, mentalists, Derren Browner, know there's a system to these cards. Even when you shuffle a pack of cards up, they can still stay in a certain order. Most people don't shuffle cards correctly. They do a series of kind of hand over hand like this. That doesn't alter the order of the cards greatly. So once you know the order of the cards, you actually seem to get more right. So that's another problem. And the final problem really was that what's really happening, right? Is the experimenter willing the image of the card? And if it is about sending thoughts, maybe the experimenter is not that good at sending thoughts. So what they eventually did was they randomized the whole thing by putting the whole thing and made it electronic, and they made it kind of computerized. But still, the results have not been overly successful. So that's the 1950s, J.B. Ryan. Puthoff and Targ were at the Stanford University Research Institute, which wasn't Stanford University. They kind of vague about that, because a lot of the reports on this by the press were Stanford University scientists study. Well, that's not exactly what was happening. However, they got really interested in psychic spying, and Puthoff and Targ were the people that really developed the idea of remote viewing. And true, if you've ever done any remote viewing, if you close your eyes and somebody's thinking of a place they've been, there is a very good chance that you may, if you're practiced enough, come up with a drawing of a place that looks close to where that person has been. The problem with Puthoff and Targ's research and the way it was criticized was they didn't have a measure of how accurate something had to be before it was considered a hit. And if somebody draws a straight line, is that a telegraph pole, a tree? Is it something else? And they were taking these overly generous approaches to proving what was a hit. What I would say, by the way, is the experiments with cards and the experiments with remote viewing is something you can practice yourself. When we used to hold the moots here at my house. At the start of a moot, I'd put something in an envelope, and then I'd place it in a known place in the room, tell people to think about the envelope and the place, and over the next month, they would actually try to work out what was in the envelope. Very interesting, because there were very few real hits. People could say things like, it's a nature scene, it's a sea, which I think is a pretty good thing, but there we go. So the other person on here is Ian Stevenson, Virginia University, 1960s, 1980s. Do you want me to stop? Oh, okay. Tony had to go. Ian Stevenson, he was a psychiatrist, and he got interested in past lives. And he spent a lot of his own personal money collecting witness statements of people who claimed they had lived before, and that they had birthmarks that were where the wounds were when they died, a lot of stuff. In fact, he analyzed over 2,500 cases of this really weird phenomena. And this guy is often quoted by people who want to support past life research, that he discovered that, past life research past lives are real because this is the evidence. In fact, he didn't. He actually says he is fascinated by the subject. He is applying no causal link. He just documented it. But this comes back to people who want to be that accurate. They want to prove a point. They take the research out of context, and they actually try to push it to prove a point. Ian Stevenson's work is fascinating. And I came across it a number of years ago when I was personally interested in some past life stuff. And the idea that he was finding people that had been shot and then there was a birthmark on the child of the person who claimed to be. There's a big problem with the research because we're not sure about how much was leading the people and how much the people were getting, shall we say, affirmation for being involved in the project. But interesting research. So there's 3 inside research that I think are interesting. Something that you probably do know, magicians have always been interested in the paranormal, the things that science says you can't do. Why? Because their livelihoods depend upon being able to fool you to believe something is happening when it may not be. Houdini, one of my personal heroes, was the escapologist. And the story goes that when his mother, who he loved dearly, died, he went to a number of mediums to try and make contact with them. One of the mediums he came to see was in England, who was the wife of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Now, Conan Doyle and Houdini were really good friends. So Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes guy, and Houdini. And Conan Doyle believed that Sherlock Holmes was the thinking, logical, deductive reasoning guy. And actually, Houdini liked the Sherlock Holmes characters and thought that Conan Doyle would actually embody some of those things. Unfortunately for Houdini, when Conan Doyle's wife tried to do the seance, she did connect with Houdini's mother, but something was wrong because the mother, speaking through the medium, was calling him Harry, was actually talking about Christian festivals, was actually talking about Christian holidays. Actually, Harry Houdini's name was Eric Weiss. He was a Jew, and he came to America before he became Americanized. And the fact that Houdini believed his mother should know that, right, actually set him at odds with Arthur Conan Doyle and basically called his wife a fraud. And that set him up on a path of, he teamed up with the American Association of Science, and he went on a medium busting trip whereby he would expose mediums that were fraudulent, expose the tricks they used, expose all the stuff. He would even go to seances as Mr. White in disguise. And then at the end of the seance, he'd throw his disguise up and go, there you go, you're cheating, there's somebody behind that curtain, which is all very theatrical. And what we must remember is one of Houdini's ulterior motives wasn't necessarily the fact that he'd been duped or that his connection with his mother had been lost, but actually he then toured America with a stage show called Do Spirits Exist and Can We Communicate with Them, which is great because at that time he was getting a little bit too old to do too many of his physical stunts. So that's what he did. However, Houdini set in motion a certain type of thinking, which said, if you're really going to look at something objectively, you need a variety of thinkers to look at it, not just necessarily the researchers. And that's where this guy called James Randi comes into it, who you may or may not have heard of. Most people involved in, shall we say, the New Age paranormal area hate James Randi because they think he's a show-off. They don't like him. But he has a standing $1 million challenge for anybody that can demonstrate any paranormal effect. And the only condition is that they both have to agree the protocols. They both have to approve the experimental method, which sometimes is quite a simple method, but sometimes it isn't. And to this date, that $1 million has never been claimed. And the people who say they've been on the Houdini challenge, Randi challenge, actually turn around and say, well, he cheated. He didn't record all the results. And of course, there's a baseless accusation because all the methods and all the stuff is published. However, there was one case where Randi nearly lost his $1 million. It was the Benevenista affair. Now, Benevenista was a homeopathist, and the homeopathist claimed exceptional results for a particular homeopathic remedy. Randi said that he would accept Benevista's information, and they together would work on a protocol to test the homeopathic remedy. the whole process was triple blinded. So nobody knew who the control group was, who the test group was, and who the neutral group was. And on the first couple of run-throughs of the trials, it looked like the homeopathic treatment was having the effect the Benveniste actually said it was having. And Randy was impressed and looked at it, and he was about to move into the stage of, okay, final test, and then we'll give you your money because this works. And I have to go back and rethink what I believe about homeopathy. But then when they tightened the protocol, they realized something had happened that wasn't Benveniste's fault. It was a devoted acolyte of Benveniste, somebody who was supporting him, and they were tinkering with the results to turn them into positive results. So this is 3 steps away from the actual experiment. They were involved with some of the collection of data and stuff, and they were tampering with the stuff, even though it was blinded. And so the Benveniste affair, as it became known, became quite an interesting thing in paranormal research. And then lastly, in this area, Banachek. Banachek, you may or may not know, but Banachek is one of the, I think he is probably one of the leading mentalists in the world. He is an advisor to magicians like Penn and Teller. He's an advisor to stage performers. He's a lecturer, he's a teacher. He's also taking on Randy's challenges in terms of trying to support inventing protocols to really test whether these things are real. Because actually both of them want to know if they're real. They don't want to debunk them. They want to know if they're real, because if it's real, then they have to reevaluate their view of the world. Now, Project Alpha was a really cool experiment. When Banachek was a teenager, he was living in South Africa, he started to read about Randy and Randy's work and wrote to Randy and said, if ever you want me to help out, I'm willing to help out. And Randy put the letter in the file drawer under A, for no other reason, just under A. And then another guy wrote and said, if you ever want to do something, I'm willing to help. Now, these were teenagers. Both of them were aspiring performing magicians. Banachek was a little bit more advanced, maybe. It was at the time it was called Steve Shaw. And so Randy discovered that one of the universities was going to take a lot of money from the government for doing some psychic research. And that would be, they want to test people's psychic abilities. So he contacted them and said, look, if you're going to have a real, true scientific exploration of these abilities, you'd need to have somebody on your team that looks at things a different way, possibly a professional magician. He didn't want the job himself, but he was going to recommend somebody. And they wrote back a rather snotty letter saying, no, we're scientists, we know exactly what we're doing, and da. So he went to his folder where these 2 letters were under the A folder, Banachek, and the other guy was Nigel, I think. And he contacted them and said, can you present yourself to this experimental group as young psychics? And will you put yourself up for testing? Well, Banachek was really up for it. So he wrote and he got accepted and he passed the tests. Randy said one thing that's really important here. If they ever ask you, are you a magician? Are you cheating? You must say yes. Right? You must say yes. And they agreed to that. And then they agreed to let Randy know about the tests they were having ahead of them. And these 2 kids went under the test, this weeks and weeks of testing. They were able to do things like turn the hands of clocks backwards. They could project images onto cameras. They could do the sort of psychic kinesis effects. And the researchers were, let's say, taken in because they were only looking at one dimension. Randy would talk to Banachek and his friend, but they would say, tomorrow they're going to get us to try and move a canister underneath a lamp. And Randy would say, have you thought about how you can do it? And they had a chat, and so they set up. And then Randy rang the researchers and said, by the way, if you're doing a test like this, look for these things, look for these problems. Well, they ignored it. And these kids moved this stuff, and it was impressive. And it went so far as to the guys, the researchers, were going to publish a paper saying they'd found real evidence for psi abilities. And at which point, Banachek particularly felt really bad about it. And so Randy went in and explained everything. And you would have thought that that would have woken the scientific community up to the fact that when you're looking at something, you need multiple pairs of eyes from multiple different disciplines, but never did. So that's Project Alpha. Fantastic story if you ever get to look it up. So to kind of almost close with, I want to share a couple of things that I got involved with myself. These weren't bits of research. They were bits of, let's call them field work that could have led to research. The first one was when I was living in London. I was interested in hypnotic past life regression because I've been reading lots. I've been reading Stevenson stuff and other people's stuff about people who've been regressed to past lives. And it occurred to me there was a flaw in the method, not in the results, but in the method. And the method was the hypnotherapist would regress the person. They'd ask them loads of questions. They'd make notes and they'd come back to the next session and the hypnotist would then regress them some more and actually ask them for more notes. Well, without any intention, the hypnotherapist could be leading the person to answer the questions that the hypnotherapist has already checked out to be correct. It was a bad method. So I thought to myself, I think I've got a better method for this. And the method I picked up on was, well, if I do the regression, I record and transcribe everything that's said, and then I send the transcripts out to 3 independent historians. They go through the material, they do the research they need to research. They then grade the quality of the information according to general knowledge, specific knowledge, or whatever. We had a grading system of 5. They then feed back to me a list of 20 questions to ask in the next sessions, some of which are based upon trying to find more information, some of which were red herrings, and I wouldn't know the difference. So therefore, I was blinded from the results. And what I did was I put out an advert in a local paper in London when I was living at the time, and asked for people interested in past life regression to take part in an experiment. And I was inundated. I never thought there'd be that many. However, I eventually narrowed it down to about 50 or so candidates, and we did the belief system tests, psychological belief system tests, what they believed, where they were at. And I decided that I wanted to pick some that were open-minded, some that were on the more skeptical end, and some that were open to it, but hadn't yet formed a firm belief. So that was my group. And we did this. And over a course of a number of months, I collected all this data and fed it back. And it was really interesting. Most of the stuff that came back to me at the end from the historical researchers was that the stuff was too general. Anybody who's done any history could actually, or read a Catherine Cookson book or whatever, could have that information. However, there was a small handful of people who my historian experts, who didn't know each other, so they couldn't collude, had come back and unilaterally said, there's something here that we had difficulty finding. It's so specific, it's got birth dates, it's got information, it's got so, and those 3 or 4 people, half a dozen people I think it was, I actually called back and we had the debrief. And that was really interesting because one of the people had a memory of 4 successive lifetimes. When one life ended, she was born again within 18 months, a year. And my historians had found the birth certificates of all of the people she claimed to be. They had even found a living relative or family of the last person she claimed to be. And at that point, ethically, I had to say, well, we'll close this down because this was a woman who didn't necessarily believe. And so it was rocking her world a bit. So she was in intense sort of debrief therapy afterwards. And she decided she didn't want to push it any further. So I was really pleased with that set of results. So I wrote them all up, sent it off to my professional association and and it all came back. And somebody said, how do you know that what you're picking up on or what this person is not a past life memory, but comes from some other source, i.e. Could be a genetic memory, could be this, and the other. And of course, I'd not even considered that in my initial protocol. So the experiment itself was flawed, but I learned a lot from it. And then an American university got in touch with me and said they liked the method, and that's what gave me the PhD, the kind of method of using that for for memory work. So that's one story, and I was excited by it. If you ask me, do I believe in past lives? For me, the jury is out. As simple as that. The haunted doctor was interesting. As soon as I arrived in Cornwall, SPR, Society for Psychical Research, contacted me and said they got a retired doctor who's been ringing them and in desperation because he was being haunted. And the guy lived out towards Falmouth, so I went out to see him, and it was interesting. He lived in an isolated cottage. When I got into his space, I realized that most of the rooms had been nailed, the doors had been nailed shut because he wanted to keep the heating down. He lived in the kitchen and he had a room upstairs, which became a study and a bedroom. And that was it, basically. Now, the thing that's interesting here is that the guy was deaf. He couldn't hear me knocking the door. So face to face was fine because he lip read, but he was profoundly deaf. And what he was telling me was that he was being woken up at certain times in the day and the night, particularly nighttime, early morning, with lights and knocking on the door. And he'd actually, because he got a scientific mind, he was a doctor, he actually diarized all of these times, dates, everything. And more interestingly, he didn't believe it. What was doing his nutting was he didn't believe in the paranormal, but this seemed to be a paranormal event. So I went up to his room where he lay, and it was a mess. There was no way light could come in under the door from the nearby road. That couldn't happen. And his shutters were shut and his curtains were drawn. So there was no light that could come in that I could see. And what was really interesting was that he described a very distinctive knock. It was and that was it. And it would happen a number of times a night. It would wake him up. This guy was deaf, so that knock was loud enough to wake him up. I went and had a look at the door that was being knocked, and there were a couple of indentations on the door, which was kind of interesting. But the thing that was fascinating for me is that his house cleaner had been in the house one afternoon, and these things happen in afternoons, and she too had heard the knock. And I asked her to describe the knock, and she went, it was now unless these two people were colluding, right? That was a bit of really interesting information. I asked the doctor what he believed it was, and he told me the sad story of losing his wife, who was a believer, and he'd lost her 10 years ago. And for a while, his granddaughter had stayed with him, which that accounted for the knocks on not the current knocks on the door, but the holes in the door where they'd been knocked, because she was a little bit of a minx. But the knocks persisted. And I agreed with him that I would actually arrange a vigil. I'd go and spend some time with him and stay overnight. And yeah, the day came when I went to go and see him. It was, I remember this vividly, it was chucking it down with rain. And I pulled into the drive, and there was this doctor in his dressing gown, shaking, soaking wet, and he wouldn't go back into his house. And I said, so what's up? That knocking, it's got worse. So after getting wet for half an hour and talking him around and promising him a hot cup of tea, we got him into the house, and he told me the story about the knocks. And as he was telling me, there was this kind of moment for himself when he said, oh, I think it's my wife telling me I should believe. And then he said, actually, I don't want to do this investigation. I think I'm going to let my wife tell me that I should believe. So I reluctantly left, went back a few days later, and the knocks had stopped. This guy had got a different viewpoint about what things were, and he felt at peace. Now, I don't know whether that was a ghost with his wife or whether it was his own acceptance of the experience, but it certainly meant that he lived out the final days of it, because he died a few months later, days of his life at peace. And I think that's really interesting. So the very last one, distance readings by clairvoyants and mediums. I was doing a radio show where people were doing readings to people who called in. And it begged the question, how could they get that information? How did they make the connection? And for mediums, eventually, told me that that's what they did. They read from photographs or they read from voices. And I said, well, are you willing to enter into an experiment? And they said, yes. If I was to give you a photograph of somebody, could you give me a reading that I can pass to them and they can verify it and see how accurate it is? And they were all up for this. So what I did was I got 6 photographs taken, head and shoulder shots. All the backgrounds were plain, the shirts were plain, there was no jewelry, nothing showing, just head and shoulder shots. And I gave these 6 photographs to the medium, numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There were 3 guys and 3 women around about the 28, 29, 35, 40, 36 age group. And they did readings and they sent me the readings. And then I sent every reading that I got, that's 6 readings times 4, to everybody, and asked them to read through to see what was accurate for them. And to be fair, a lot of people wrote back and said, yeah, that describes me, that describes me. And they were about 60% accurate as far as the measurements. But here's the thing. Psychologists never really tell you what the experiment's about sometimes. And what I didn't tell them, that was one of the photographs was a very good friend of mine who was 30 and he was dead. And none of the meetings picked that up. And in fact, all of them said, such and such person B is going to be very successful in the next few years. They gave him a reading of his current and existing future, even though he'd passed. And when we showed the results to the mediums, fair dues to them, they actually took it on the chin and said, oh, wow, yeah, we didn't get he was dead. Yeah. But what happened was, and bless them, and I know these people quite well. In fact, maybe if you're in and around, you know these people. Bless them, the following week when I spoke to them again, they were retelling the story, but focusing on the 60% of things that they personally had got right. They glossed over the fact that one of the people who they thought should communicate with them didn't. Now, that's not dismissing these guys and their abilities. What it is doing is making us think carefully about what it is we're doing when we're doing psychic investigations. If there are other people observing an investigation, they will be influenced by whatever happens in that investigation. I'm going to come back to something that I think is really interesting, a dowsing example. I like dowsing. I think there's something in it. I don't know what it is, but I think there's something in it. However, experiments that were conducted in Germany about 5-6 years ago, and later again in Britain by Chris French, got dowsers who were able to find flowing water. And they put them in what science does, a controlled environment, in an aircraft hangar with a false floor and pipes underneath the floor where water could be directed. And the dowsers were given the instruction, if you can find water, show us where the water course is. Unbeknownst to they were told that the water course would change, by the way, but unbeknownst to the experimenter and the dowsers, there was a randomized computer switching center that would allow the water to go through one channel in one run, but then a different channel in another run, and a different channel in another run, and it was random. Nobody knew what was happening. And in the experiment, none of the dowsers could track the water flow, none of them. They were gracious enough to realize something, that they couldn't do it, and they questioned it. Put those dowsers into the natural world, and they did do it. Which tells me that when you control an environment too much, you take away all of the connection that people have with the land in this case. Yeah. And so we're never, ever really going to be able to put paranormal and psychic abilities under the microscope as we would like to as scientists. But as people willing to observe experiences, then we can explore them. I was going to talk a little bit about, I'll talk about this another time, but quantum physics and quantum mysticism are 2 different things. Quantum mysticism tends to use quantum physics to explain everything that's mystical. And up until about 5-6 years ago, I would have put quantum physics into the category of a kind of intellectual red herring. However, I read something quite recently that's made me rethink that. I would have said that quantum effects only ever happen on the micro scale. And there's lots of research now from an area called quantum biology. Sounds really weird. This is actually bona fide science, because the way they do it, that seems to highlight the fact that some birds navigate because of quantum entanglement. It's not just the magnetic field that makes them navigate. There are quantum entangled particles in their parts of their brain that when the magnetic field changes, one of them spins differently, tells the other one to spin differently, and then it actually moves. There's evidence that our sense of smell isn't just about a lock and key hypothesis for molecules, because you can adapt a molecule to have the same shape, but it won't smell the same. And we now think there is a quantum explanation for smell to do with particles and waves. And therefore, the nose not only gets the particle, but actually detects the sound of the frequency of the wave to give it a smell. And the one that we all know from school, photosynthesis, actually now seems to rely upon a quantum wave effect to make the energy work. So there is mileage in some of this quantum stuff. I just think we need to be very careful about how and when we apply it. So that's an overview of the big field. There, any one of these topics we could have drilled down into, but I just wanted to get you thinking. I love this Archibald Wheeler quote: "There are many modes of thinking about the world and our place in it. I consider all angles from which we might gain perspective on our amazing universe and the nature of existence." For me, Archibald Wheeler started to talk about the stuff that we're talking about, but from a scientific mindset, and actually opened some questions. The other guy that's a personal hero is a guy called Carl Sagan, and he was a skeptic, but he was actually saying that he's humble enough to know that he doesn't know everything. And therefore, when he's talking about belief in God, for example, he says, at the moment, I don't know. And that is a really intelligent position to be, because if you don't know, you can't prejudge, and you approach the data neutrally. You don't approach it with a group mindset, or you don't approach it with, we've got to prove this is to be true. You approach it with a, well, what if it's true? What does it mean? How can we test it? And the quote that I've kind of adapted from somebody or other, I know enough to know that I don't know, but hell, the path towards deeper knowledge is an exciting and serpent-like, because it is. And the more I know about this stuff, the less I know. But I'm hoping that what you might have got from this is a real passion to start exploring the stuff that interests you. And you don't have to test anything, by the way. Beliefs aren't meant to be tested, perhaps. Beliefs are beliefs. But if you hold a belief to be true and universally true, then maybe it's worth saying, well, how could I prove that? Which brings me back to the last story of the reason that experiment with the mediums happened with the photographs was that on air, one of the mediums said to me, really good question, could I tell her the evidence that I would need to prove that she was talking to my auntie or my nan or whatever? And I said, yes, I can, if you can give me the evidence you would need to prove you were not. And she stopped, and she went outside for a cigarette and came back in and said, I don't answer that question online, because if I try to answer it, I may undermine my belief. And I thought that was a very brave and very honest thing to say, because actually it's not about trying to prove that you know something. It's trying to explore the experience of what you know and the experience of what you believe. So when it comes back to this paranormal research thing, I said I was going to be provocative, but actually I sit in this area where I've called it rational mysticism. I don't know, but I'm interested enough to want to know. And I'm interested enough to look, when people tell me there's evidence, show me the evidence. What's your best evidence? And I'll look at it. If they just want to talk about their experience, tell me about your experience. And they're two different approaches. And the problem comes, I think, when science tries to do too much on the mystical front, because it can't ask those questions. because it can't reduce the environment in the same way it wants to. And when mystics or the paranormal mob want to try and use science to justify their findings, because their findings are often based upon imprecise measurements and imprecise methodologies. And on that note, I think I've done. So I am now hoping you